Hello, everybody. Welcome once again to Mental Health Matters on 1037 WPVM, the voice of Asheville. I'm Todd Weatherly, your host, therapeutic consultant, behavioral health expert. I'm happy to be here today with a buddy of mine, Ms. Karla Gomez. She is with Aspen Growth Coaching, which is a parent coaching organization. She lives in Miami, but she serves individuals all over the country, individuals, parents, and families who are dealing with an adolescent or a young adult that's coming out of treatment and then trying to integrate back into the world. That is the service that Aspen Growth Coaching does, and
Mhm.
something that we rely on fairly regularly in our practice as well. Carla holds a bachelor's degree in human resource management. That certainly helps. With organizational behavior and a master's in psychology with a postmaster's in trauma counseling. Carla's a robust experience in residential treatment ranges from clinical work to case management to outreach and admissions, serving clients at every phase of their healing process. And a constant pursuit to understand the human being beyond the traumas that confine them. Carla is informed fully by resilience-based methods and is skilled at bringing her own story of deep loss to the forefront, knowing what it is for her family not to have a place like Aspen Growth Coaching. Carly has skin into the game and is on the mission to make the sort of care status quo. Carla strives to always understand the whole human, working towards autonomy and self-awareness, and takes great pride in holding space for others to become vulnerable and accountable, allowing true growth to take place. Fun fact, she's also a former sous chef, which I think is pretty cool. Um, Now, how long ago did you and I meet, Carla? It was, we
Um,
spent time in Puerto Rico down there doing a conference
we did.
last
I mean,
year.
we shared our love over coffee.
We shared a love of coffee, but you and I met before then. I think we met maybe at a TCA training a couple of years ago.
Um, I
You were
want to
hanging out with them.
say, I want to say it was either School Connections or some other conference like that a couple of years
Right.
ago. But I feel it was like, yeah, like 2.5 years ago, maybe.
Yeah. And now I haven't worked with you specifically. My team has worked with your team before,
Hmm.
with folks coming out of treatment and specifically a young adult that we were working with. I remember at least a year or so ago. But it was one of my team members was working with one of your team members, and we very much enjoyed doing that. But you talk about in the bio, you're talking about your personal experience with grief and loss. Tell me
Hmm.
a little bit about that,
Ooh, well,
if you're
that's a loaded.
willing.
Yeah, of course, I'm always willing. So I always talk about how at AGC we don't just do parent coaching. We really work with mental health altogether, right? And one of the biggest things that I am an advocate for is being of service to families that didn't have access to care, like we didn't have access to care, right?
Right.
And it's not necessarily that we didn't have access to treatment because we did, but all the other parallel processes that should be happening to educate the family as to what the individual is going through, right? Because we lost my brother a couple of years ago, and it was something that really rocked the way that I perceived mental health, rocked the way that I perceived supporting a loved one. Right around that time, I was going back to school. I was educating myself as to like what I wanted to do beyond the culinary world. And, it became very clear that I wanted to be the type of professional that I didn't have access to growing up. I wanted to
Mm.
avoid people from becoming the outcome that I'm currently living with and that I'm going to have to continue living with for the rest of my life. And that requires an entire understanding of a person rather than just their mental presentation and their behavioral presentation, right? Because
Right.
for the most part, treatments, and this isn't to really knock any treatment down or modality down, but it's very difficult to encompass the entire family system, right? It's difficult to treat the quote unquote identified patient, and also educate and ensure that there is congruency for the rest of the family and the supporting system, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of what we do is really address that from a root cause, is ensuring that we're seeing far beyond the behavioral presentations. Those presentations are not our starting line. We're questioning really where is it coming from? Is there other psychological root causes, or is there something physiological that could also be interpreting that? and really supporting the rest of the family system as well. So I think through my own grief, I was able to find a lot of compassion and a lot of just pure passion for wanting to help other people not have to go through what we went through.
Right. Well, like you say, and bring it home.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that our work is as consultants, even though we're not a direct provider like you are, we're kind of continuity guarantors.
Mm-hmm.
We're making sure that whoever is the quote unquote identified patient, right, that
Mm-hmm.
they're taking all these steps, that we're pulling in resources that cause the family to be engaged at the level they need to be engaged in, and have those come together. Because, and you and I have been trying to work with a recent referral I sent your way who's a little
Mm-hmm.
resistant, and it's I think it and I was talking about this just the other day, but families get hijacked.
Mm-hmm.
They get hijacked by crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And then if they stay long enough in, kind of in this dyad of relation to crisis, my loved one, whether it's my child or maybe it's my spouse or somebody, my loved
Mm-hmm.
one is in crisis, and I'm hyper vigilant because that person's in crisis, and I'm worried about them, and I want it to work, and I want them to get the care they need. And if you spend long enough there, I find that parents don't know how to come off of it.
Yeah. Well, it's the chaos that they're comfortable with, right?
Right.
And I think if you stay in that position long enough, you tend to seek it as a family dynamic, right? Like
Yeah,
that's the
you'll
family system.
sabotage care as a
Yeah,
result.
that's
Hmm.
right. That's the relational dynamic that you're used to. And peace and health can be really daunting if all you've known is dysfunction and sickness and illness, right?
Yeah.
I think part of what we are working our butts off and part of what just makes us so intentional as to the work that we do is yes, intervention in our world is always going to be present, right? People are always going to need help at the moment of crisis. But really, where it becomes pivotal and where we can make generational and larger scheme change is when we start focusing on prevention. How do we understand and study what has been happening at a systematic level so that we can start creating
A,
strategies
a
and
different system.
right, and so that we can start educating people on to understand like what happened, how did you get here, and how do you prevent from getting here moving forward. And if you do get here again, how do you address it in a way that doesn't entirely derail your family
Yeah.
system or that health.
And it's super important that, like, how do you see it coming? Like, I think that, by the time you're in the midst of what is ultimately either an entrained behavioral reaction, either
Mm-hmm.
to somebody's crisis or to somebody's behavior, or your own behavior in the context of the people that you're surrounded by and the circumstance, by the time you're reacting, it's too late. Whatever strategy you should have used before you got to that place, and it's very
Mm-hmm.
hard to reel all that back. So, one of the first strategies for anybody, including family members, is to see it coming, and to use like preventative skills and tools and language and different systems.
Mm-hmm.
Part one of the things that you see in wilderness programming a lot, is that they'll have a language that they give to parents. So when their child comes home, they're using that language. Hey, I don't I want to bust a fab with you, feeling, action, behavior. I want to talk about this thing with you, and this is what I see, and this is how it impacts me. How do you feel about that? And then they already have this engaged dialogue methodology that can live in the home.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and but they're also not professionals at it. So you get a professional like you involved who's coming into the home after the fact, and some changes have been made, the person's stabilized, maybe they've made some real growth, and turned some corners, but
Mm-hmm.
now they're back in this environment. And this is, I think, what families and people don't really understand. I said, well, the hardest move you'll ever make is transitioning from treatment back into a regular environment.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably the most vulnerable time that you have. People think that the crisis is the vulnerable time. It's like, well, no, we kind of know what to do about the crisis. We
Yeah.
we can see it. It's ugly. It's screaming at the top of its lungs. when you come home and you've got had all this clinical care and all these people around you and all this support, and you've made all these what you feel like are growth moments, and then suddenly you're back in an environment where all those stressors show back up again. Are,
Yeah,
are you
absolutely.
are you ready to deal with that? And it's like if they've got somebody like you who's just like, okay, let's take a minute, let's remember what we've learned,
Hmm.
let's figure out how that exists in the home
Hmm.
because it takes on its own character, doesn't it? Like it really
Yeah,
does. There's a language that we use in therapeutic environments, but there's a language that families use that's unique to them, and
yeah,
those two things have to merge. They have to come together so that they have something they feel comfortable with. So it doesn't feel like
right,
treatment anymore, right?
right. Yeah.
How do you bridge that with them?
Ooh, I love this question. I love the idea of utilizing language to ensure that everybody's understanding and identifying with an experience within the same context. But it can also be so detrimental if they're just kind of throwing a slip on of a language without really doing the introspective work. What does this word mean for me? How am I
Mm,
communicating my feelings and my thoughts and the way that something is affecting me and the family system in an adequate way where I not only consider their experience, but I also consider how their behavior is rocking our existence, right? And I think there needs to be an amplified and flexible, how do I say it? There needs to be a conversation before you even understand what the language is within a home. We can't just throw a bunch of therapeutic language at a family system and hope it works,
and,
right?
and
Like,
and expect it to stick.
and
Yeah,
expect it to stick. I also think that can be incredibly detrimental because what if a person is just sick and tired of hearing therapy language, which
yeah.
happens and it's perfectly valid.
Or
I
they get
have
real therapy savvy and
and then they
they
turn it
throw a bunch of therapy language at people to
around.
maintain their crap. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? Like,
and then they turn it around.
oh my
I
gosh, it's
think it's
messy.
I mean, it's so important, and I'm not gonna minimize the importance of being able to utilize a language that does thoroughly encompass the experience, right? And understands what's happening for the person. But I also cannot stress enough how important it is to ensure that there's also that introspection, that there's also the understanding that everybody is considering people at a threshold. And I tell this to all of my clients, like mine and people that are outside of my caseload that are working with our organization. If you switch for a second and you start perceiving your loved ones from a method or from a lens of threshold, that is going to change your tendencies and your responsiveness and
Hmm.
just your approach and consideration to them drastically. And it's a very attainable methodology to utilize. If you
Yeah.
start considering them to like, do they have the capacity to deal with this today? Is their nervous system in a position to
Or
even,
in this moment, like, is it they
right,
they
in
might be
this
able to do it
moment?
today, but not first thing in the morning,
Right.
right?
I know. Like I tell my kid all the time, like, baby,
Look,
if I haven't had my cue and coffee, don't
look.
speak to me.
I was gonna say we haven't had coffee yet. We're not talking yet. You
Like
understand?
that's my
Like,
threshold. And so if we just give a little bit of leeway to that threshold and to that understanding that capacity is at stake here, right? Like we have to understand that it isn't just language. Is their ability to even comprehend what's
yeah.
happening throughout the day.
Well, I'm glad that you say that because, when you first start talking, I think, well, it's kind of like in science. It's like definition of terms. Everybody's got to be operating with the same definition, right?
Yeah.
They've all got to be working with the same. This word means the same thing to me as the same as it means to you.
Hmm.
Sure, that's important, but this the concept of threshold. I get, I think that one of the things that crisis does to families is that whenever they feel like something needs to be resolved, it has to be resolved right now and in a hurry.
That sense of urgency. Yeah.
It's always like right now and it's got to happen all at once. And I want all the
Hmm.
answers and I want it to be fixed and I want it to be done.
Hmm.
Mostly because I want to resolve my own anxiety, not
Yeah.
necessarily because I've
Yeah.
thought beyond that to see what would actually, cause the situation to shift.
Yeah.
Um, until I need that dose of anxiety again, in which case I'll stir it up so that I can have it, and then feel
Right.
like I need to resolve it. There's that pattern.
Hmm.
So you've got to acknowledge your own pattern,
Hmm.
emotional pattern within the context of this relationship and what has ultimately been a crisis up to this point. And
Mhm.
then you can like, okay, where's let's address this threshold question.
Mhm.
Can they handle this today? When, do I feel like it's important? Okay, it's important. How important is it? Does that have to be resolved right now? No.
Mhm.
Is it something we can work on steadily? Yes. Is it something I
Mhm.
need help working on? Probably.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think there's a there's a beauty to what you're doing,
Yeah.
because it's I was talking to I had an interview not long ago with Ross Ellenhorn. He's got a new book called Holdings, and he talks about holding space.
Mhm.
We're in here, we're holding the space for people, and sometimes that's through our language, sometimes it's just through our presence.
Mhm.
Whatever it is, but there's this beauty that happens when you add a supportive presence to a scenario where a person can kind of like, it's not all on me. I can relax a little bit. If I run into trouble, I got somebody helping me. Everybody feels that way, and the whole thing calms down.
Mhm.
Until what you do is you give them a baseline that they understand they've got to, like, our baseline should feel like this.
Mhm.
Carla's here helping me understand and feel and experience this baseline so that
Mhm.
hopefully in a little while we can create this baseline for ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's the there's this subtlety and there's this beauty of the work, and that's kind of what you're doing. Like,
Yeah.
realizing a new baseline.
Yeah, I talk about that baseline all the time. That's language that's very much in my back pocket. I At AGC, one of the things that we do that I find beautiful, and again, I'm very biased because I love the work that we do. Beyond the sessions, you have access to us through a Voxer app, which is kind of like WhatsApp.
Yeah.
It's an app that you can continue communicating with us, and it
Super
works
compliant.
right. It works
Right.
beautifully because you have us in your pocket. As things are coming up, we're talking about that baseline. Yes, we can identify what are the things that you need to work on, what are the things that are showing up in your family system that are detrimental towards it and towards the progress that you're trying to make. But what about accountability? What about the things that we discuss that we want to move towards, right? What about the behaviors that are incredibly detrimental and we know are keeping you in this loop, right? And so part of the work that we do is really facilitating that baseline, reminding people that we are going to tap out of certain behaviors and certain thoughts by utilizing these tools. Because we can get in session, right? And we can have a great session, and then I walk out of the session and I'm like, well, what did I just say? Like it's so overwhelming and there's so much information being tossed out and you're kind of sorting through so many thoughts and feelings and events that you walk out floored, right? Like you're like, what now? Like what am I supposed to do? Part of that baseline and part of the shift and I think one of the most beautiful things that we do is that we maintain that accountability through keeping us in your pocket, right? Like you can continue reaching out to us, and as things come up, and whether it's a fight, whether it's a crisis moment, whether it's a conversation, that you have access to different tools in that moment that are going to define what your baseline is going to look
Yeah.
like moving forward.
Yeah, because the healing process happens real time. You know what I mean? It's
Hmm.
like it's hard to contain in sessions and in these kind
Yeah.
of scripted, you're going to show up, we're going to do things for an hour, and then you're going to go
Yeah.
off and you're going to have everything right. It's like, no,
Hmm.
you're going to walk out and you're going to stumble over it and you're going to try to remember what it is that we said. And,
Hmm.
especially for a person who's done, I don't know if you run into this, but I certainly do. And I'm guessing you do as well. But like, I'll be on the phone with a family or I'll be having a conversation and I'll say something. I'll give them, well, what you need to do is this, and this is the process this person is going through, and this is like,
Hmm.
and I'm not even, because we've been in the field for the amount of time we have, and we're professionals in the field, and it's like I don't even think about it,
Yeah.
and then I realize I have to slow down
Yeah.
because it's like, wait, can you? I don't even know what that means, and I
Can you break that
can
framework
you
down?
break that down for me? And the compliment I got recently, which was one of the biggest compliments I ever got, was like, you do such a good job of making all this complex stuff and framing it in a way that makes it understandable. I'm like,
Yeah.
I have literally been trying to work on that for 20 years.
Yeah.
And I had an experience when some of my early time in the field, I worked at a re-education center in North Carolina, called the Wright School in Durham, North Carolina. One of the first places I ever worked out of college. And I was doing a class and these are kids that are like referred from the regular education system, got behavioral challenges. They're given an alternative classroom experience in a therapeutic environment so that they can hopefully reintegrate back into the classroom. So you got a lot of kids from impoverished families and
Yeah.
different, scenarios and everything like that. You've got just a fairly wide population. So I got a bunch of kids sitting there, and I'm giving them a biology talk because I partially, love biology and felt like
I
I
love
could deliver the
biology.
topic. Oh yeah,
Hmm.
it's great. Almost majored in it.
Yeah.
And so I was like, so we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about humans and human beings, and we're going to talk about behavior, and we're going to talk about how it interacts with the natural world and
Hmm.
some of the functions of the body and all that. And this kid's looking at me. She's got she's got the deer in the headlight, and I'm like, looks like you're not like what can I help you
What's
with?
happening?
Like, what's happening? She's like, what is a human? Didn't know what the word human meant,
Hmm.
and it smacked me across the face. I was just like,
Yeah.
like,
That's
dude,
humbling too.
it's humbling.
Yeah.
It's humbling. It's like, okay,
Hmm.
apparently I'm gonna have to slow down.
Yeah. That's
And
very.
you get those moments enough times that you're like, okay,
Hmm.
let's take this a chunk at a time,
Yeah.
and help this family approach this in a way that's meaningful and significant to them. Um,
Hmm.
and I think that
Yeah.
that's not only what you're doing, but you're also crafting a new vision for them, aren't you? Like
Yeah.
helping them
I
craft this idea of family, right?
Yeah, I can almost like equate that to when I'm in the kitchen, I cook with my nose, right? Like I've been cooking for so many years that I don't need a recipe. I cook with my nose and it drives my heart, and that's the recipe. Like that's how I show up in the kitchen. It's very similar to the way that I show up in sessions. Because I've been doing this
You
work for
cook
so
with your
long,
nose.
yeah, you know what's
Yeah.
happening, and you can assess beyond just the presentations that either the parents are reporting or that a potential assessment has reported in the past, right? And I think it has so much more to do with like asking the right questions and digging a little further than what's currently being presented to understand like how did we even get here. Like your
Right.
best judgment landed you in my caseload, your best judgment landed you in a position of looking for help because you understand that you're way outside of context here for your realm of understanding. And how
Right.
do we ensure that the what's happening here is as easily applicable to your world and to the way that you live your life and to the comprehension and the way that you show up as a human being too, right? Like I could talk about multicultural approach and consideration and multi-general what is it
Generational. Yeah.
generational multi-generational consideration for ages, because I think that's where we're at right now. There's like these larger gaps of generations and such wildly different considerations and approaches to lifestyle that I think do show up time and time again in the work that we're doing. There's an expectation in outcome, there's an expectation in relational dynamics, there's an expectation in how people should be behaving, and that shows up both in a larger social scheme, but I see it time and time again playing out in familial dynamics.
Yeah. I think of that because I used to do family mediation, like divorce and
Mm,
separation and stuff like that, custody.
okay.
Um, and you would run in, especially when you've got uncles and grandparents and things like that going on, because it was a community mediation center. So we were dealing with people who couldn't afford attorneys essentially, but were
Yeah.
looking for a way to kind of navigate through.
Hmm.
And you'd run into a lot of that.
Hmm.
One wanted it this way, one wanted it that way, and they would start putting a bunch of rules and things like that. It's like, well, I want to do this, that, and the other. And I would sit back every once in a while, and I'm curious about your experience here, but I'd sit back and I'm like, this feels like an elaborate ruse. All this stuff that everybody's writing down, these details, they feel like this just, to
Yeah.
me, my gut's just saying like
Yeah.
none of this is actually important because none of it's the actual thing that anybody wants to talk about
Yes.
because it feels too ugly.
Yep.
Somebody like maybe grandma doesn't want to be a mom again,
Yeah. Yeah.
or maybe it's, or maybe the separating parents,
Mhm.
you know, don't want to separate, or they're
Mhm.
going to fight over something that's very contentious, and they don't want to go there, or whatever it was, and so they throw a bunch of stuff out.
Mhm.
Well, if we're going to do this, we got to do this, and I'd start taking notes and everything else, and I'm like, this is a bunch of
Yeah.
BS, is what this
Like, come
is,
on.
right? Like, come on.
Really, give it to me. What's really
What
going on
what's
here?
and sometimes you just have to separate people out and be like, look, can you just
Yeah.
tell me what the heck's going on here for a second?
Mhm.
Because I feel like we're not getting anywhere with this, and I think I know
Yeah.
why.
Right.
Do you find that happens?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that's why I love our model so much, because I call it the velvet sledgehammer. Like,
The
I'm
velvet
gonna
hammer.
get in there. I'm gonna get in there and I'm gonna start addressing the elephant in the room that hasn't been addressed for the last 30 years. Like, you're gonna sit in session with us and we're gonna talk about this and we're gonna figure out what are the next action items that are going to be presented and how we're gonna move away from this. But absolutely, I mean, it's very easy to fall into, both as a professional and as a human being, it's easy to fall into these patterns where you can talk about it and talk about it and talk about it, and you can try to intellectualize a problem all you want, but at what cost? And at a certain point, it's not just going to be with you, it's going to be with the generations that follow. Like,
Yeah,
this is exactly why I got in the line of work that I'm doing. I don't want my kid to have to deal with what I dealt with. I don't want, and it isn't because my parents did anything wrong, but it's natural, it's just the organic exposure that I had through the problems that we endured growing up. And so it's up to me as her mother to ensure that what has happened across 3 generations at this point doesn't happen again. But it requires me talking about the things that nobody has wanted to talk about, addressing the elephant in the room, and bringing up a lot of things that people weren't necessarily prepared to be brought up, right? And I think
right.
that's really what happens in family systems. You have these big secrets, you have these big events that happen, or these behaviors that happen. And it's much easier for people to just have an identified patient and somebody that's just the rebel, somebody that is
They're
just,
the
this is
problem.
the person. Yeah, they're the problem. This is who's messing up right now. This is messing up our reputation and the way that the world perceives us. But what is the family system and what are the behaviors and the environment that have supported and enabled these tendencies, right? And that isn't to generalize it, because there are so many different ways that problems like that can emerge. Um, but I do think that people tend to kind of sweep things under the rug and present what they believe will get them a level of interaction and feedback. Whereas the work that we do and where we can be much more efficient and valuable as professionals is bringing out the things that we know are hidden behind those words, right? Like, we can see beneath that. That's like the nose in the kitchen all over
It's the
again.
nose of the kitchen. That's exactly
Hmm.
what it is. Yeah, yeah. Strongly intuitive.
Yeah.
Um, it's a tool, and I think that it's, for people who are kind of suited to be in the work, it's a tool you use without, you also to get towed under. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, you're not snagged by the family dynamic, and you're not towed
Hmm.
under by the energy that's being put out in the room and this stuff. And it's just like, okay, it's gonna water off a duck's back on me.
Hmm.
It's not mine. I've got my own stuff I have to deal with, right? But
Hmm.
and I do my work, but I don't have to take yours on.
Hmm. Yeah,
And you got to
and
be careful about that. So
it's so hard. We talk about, I mean, if you have a team of professionals that are your peers that can catch that on, that's incredibly helpful to have. But in the work that we do, it's emotionally and psychologically charged, right? It's both, and I was talking about this and I even wrote about it. It's both beautiful and devastating within the same breath.
Yeah.
It's beautiful because we get to dive right into the epicenter of problems that have probably been spewing for decades and across generations. And this is just the way that it's resurfacing and that it's projecting to the outside world, right? It also is incredibly heavy for us, right? More so if we're people like, I'm somebody that has been through a lot, right? I need to be incredibly um, aware of when things are potentially activating me, on when they're disrupting my own functioning and my own bias and my own ability to support a family system, right? But that again requires that awareness and that introspection and authenticity to be able to step back and say, either this is too much for me and I need to transfer it over to somebody else, or what do I need to do for myself to get ready and to prepare myself to be able to support this family system.
Get clear. Yeah.
Very clear.
And be clear when you're in that moment. Or you'll
Yeah.
drag your own crap into it, you know.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you ever do you remember any experience that you've had where that has been a decision you've had to make?
I think early on, when you get, I entered into the field in a pretty intense environment, like 5 days on shift, single covered,
Mhm.
12 adjudicated, court referred youth,
Yeah.
inner city kids now in the woods for the first time having to do treatment instead of going to
Yeah.
jail. I mean, like those kids taught me a lot.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, and you'd go home and just like have to shake it off.
Yeah, you go home and you're like, "Okay, hi family."
I go home and like, I mean, this is the early '90s, so I'd go home and watch Beavis and Butthead and just laugh.
I love that show.
I'm like, these are my kids. You know what I mean? Like these are my kids. They really are. In the best kind of way. And it's like,
Yeah.
and you had to figure out ways to do release.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. It's like when you figure out how to do release, when you figure out how to do it, like you can do it more economically and efficiently. You can do it in the moment.
Absolutely.
But like when you're getting started, you have to figure it out. Um,
Yeah, it's tough in the beginning.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, and I still think that there are people just like anything. I was not built in the world to be an accountant. You know what I mean? Thank God there
Mhm.
are accountants.
Yeah.
It's not that I can't do math; I just don't like doing
Same. Same,
it.
same.
I'm actually quite good at math if I have to do it, but
Right.
trying to focus on it is just like I might get it wrong, and I'll
Yeah.
screw up some numbers, and somebody who does that and likes doing it, and that's their temperament. There's people
Yeah.
in the world that do
You can
that.
go do
Thank God for them.
that. Same.
I was built a certain way, and people
Yeah.
look at what you and I do and like, how do you do that? I'm like, I
Yeah.
I don't know how not to do it now.
Exactly. I think the work that we do is all about systems.
Oh
And
yeah,
it's funny to talk about mental health and how to be a professional in this world and talk about systems, but I cannot stress enough how often and how efficient it's been for me to understand mental health and the way that it shows up in a family system when I understand them beyond their systems. Like,
yeah,
how is this showing up in their nervous system? How is it showing up in their bodies physiologically and psychologically? How is that then showing up behaviorally, right? And just tying up or connecting those dots, connecting those dots, right? Connecting the dots and being able to be like, oh, these are the systems that are then employing the way that they're showing up in the world. And then this is how we can either reverse engineer it or then adapt this new system to be able to get them new results. So I can talk about systems all day, every day.
right. Kind of like a kitchen, really.
It really is. I know. I know. So I'm very much like operationally like that.
Yeah, totally, totally. Well, and there's also especially with the level of mental health that we deal with, pretty
Mhm.
intense and complex cases and everything else. And you spend long enough in the field, like you see it out in the world, like goes.
There's a nose. We talk about the
There's
nose
the
in the
nose.
kitchen.
I can smell it.
You can smell it from a mile away.
You
And
smell bipolar from 1,000 yards.
I know, and it's so hard. I talk about this with my friends all the time. It's so difficult to shut that off because you want to just, I mean,
Yeah.
it's really hard for me to not immediately want to like offer help and say like, hey, there's something that's showing up for you. And that's also not my place, right? Like,
Yeah.
unless somebody has made the intentional decision to seek help, we can't really be putting that out
I'm
there
not
either.
at work.
Yep. I'm not at
That's
work.
not
I
my
can be
client.
human for a little bit.
Sometimes they still find you, but
I know.
yeah,
I know.
sometimes they do. That's okay. You're welcome to, if you show up and you ask for help, I'm going to give you whatever I can. I mean,
Oh,
that's just how it's
same.
going to
I
be.
mean, yeah, I was built for this. I was built for
Yeah.
this. I was definitely put on earth to be able to just offer help and support to other humans.
Well, Carla, I'm glad that you found your way to us all
Thank
and the
you.
beautiful things that you do. Thank you so much for being on the show today. This has been Mental Health Matters on 1037 WPVM, the voice of Asheville. I've been Todd Weatherly, your host, with Karla Gomez and Aspen Growth Coaching. Carla, thanks a lot for being with us.
Thank you for having me and sharing my cafecito.
You're welcome.